my friends are simps.
Something that I've been thinking about a lot recently is the idea of how to expect, manage, and then sustain creative impulses, especially if, like me, you're somebody that can be perhaps a bit intense and also have quite a short attention span. What I've come to realise or recognise is that I often go through periods where I will become hyper-focused on a specific project or idea, completely consumed by the possibilities and a desire to realise those. As a result of such deep engagement with a particular topic or task, these can be times of incredible productivity where it feels like I'm tapped into some deep well of seemingly endless drive and motivation. And I frequently get comments or questions in real life from people that can't wrap their head around that, especially if they aren't necessarily creatively minded themselves. You know, how do you have the energy to do all this stuff? Where does that come from? Like, when do you sleep? Why do you even bother? I imagine that this might be akin to what some people would describe as creative flow, and I definitely do resonate with that idea. One of the reasons that I love Eurorack, for example, is that when building out a patch in my modular system, it often gets to a point where once you've slogged through all of the initial stages, things just start to come alive in this really natural and organic way. It really feels magical, as if you're swept up in some kind of symbiosis with the music, if you will. And that can be incredibly satisfying on quite a deep level. I would almost even compare the sensation to parts of a psychedelic experience where it's just all-encompassing in a really pleasant way. However, I would also probably distinguish that kind of sensation from what I'm talking about in this video, which is often more erratic, extended periods of hyperfocus or even fixation. These waves, as I've come to think about them, are something that I deal with on an almost constant basis. And as a result, I can find it really difficult to do basic things like sleep or tidy up, as you can probably see, or even just think about anything else. Probably doesn't help that my mind is already naturally most active in the wee hours of the morning, leading to a lifetime of chronic insomnia and sleeplessness. These glasses kind of hide the bags under my eyes, thankfully. From a creative standpoint, this kind of cyclical pattern also isn't ideal for a number of reasons. For a start, whilst I don't ever really experience anymore anyway what I would describe as creative block because of these cycles, I do routinely get frustrated in my complete inability to turn my attention to particular projects that I might rationally want to move forward because my focus is directed towards something else. For example, my MPC 2500, which you can't see here in the background, I've got a bunch of projects that I've been working on with vinyl records, sampling them, etc. And I really want to complete them, but I just don't feel much motivation to do that just now because I've got other stuff I'm working on. And that can be quite frustrating. By the same token, I also tend to second guess the quality of what I'm doing during these periods of extended productivity. I've got, vivid memories of times where I've been able to write, record, and finish multiple entire songs seemingly effortlessly to the point that it felt like cheating. And I've sat and thought to myself that, maybe you should slow down here because surely nothing that happens that easily can be any good. Now, whether or not they are is kind of a moot point. Ultimately, the problem for me with all of this has been that this kind of all-consuming intensity leaves me feeling like I'm not actually in control and I'm just at the mercy of my own whims. Some kind of completely passive actor just along for the ride. And that can be really exhausting at times and, in all honesty, a wee bit scary. I suspect that this is something that a lot of people might experience without necessarily realising it, and that it probably underpins a lot of what we see and talk about as gear acquisition syndrome, or G.A.S. We get so easily caught up in the possibilities offered by a particular synthesizer or other bit of gear that it can be hard to see past those and view things more objectively. We fall down these endless rabbit holes one after the other where the dopamine rush of exploring those warrens becomes the reward in of itself rather than actually creating something, which is kind of meant to be the whole point. Now, I don't have any definitive answers to all of these problems. This studio, along with the fact that I was up until 4:30 AM obsessively bashing out notes for this very video, should demonstrate quite clearly I don't have this all figured out. However, there have been some things that I think I've managed to do to at least reframe the way that I think about some of those conflicts internally and have them feel less emotionally taxing, at least at times, to kind of embrace those cycles in a less destructive or more sustainable fashion. The first and most important thing for me has been to recognize the existence of these waves of intensity or creative motivation. If you're not aware of them happening, or you don't realize and appreciate that this is how you tend to operate, then it can be much harder to actually do anything about them. So that's step one. Know that that is a thing. The second thing is to understand that these cycles are not necessarily inherently bad. Going through periods of particular interest and motivation is completely natural, and if you can harness them, they can actually be a really positive force. After all, the ability to be able to focus on a particular project so intently is something that lots of people would love to be able to do, and it can almost seem like a superpower as a result. The key is to recognize what are genuine cycles of interest where your immediate focus just shifts for a certain period of time versus temporary, fleeting fixations that you get swept up in. In other words, is this something that you're genuinely passionate about and invested in, or is it just based on some kind of short-term novelty? When a good wave does come along, ensure that you ride it out. In other words, make the most of those bursts of creativity and productivity whilst you can. Don't second guess where the energy has come from or worry about directing your attention to other projects, at least not whilst those can wait anyway. Make hay whilst the sun shines, strike whilst the iron is hot, squeeze the lemon, and don't let yourself feel guilty about not using certain bits of gear whilst you're focused on advancing or completing another project that doesn't need them. Their time will come, and if they don't over a longer period of multiple waves, then that is probably the time then to consider moving them on. One of the hardest but most necessary things to learn is how to break unhelpful patterns or unhealthy fixations when you realise that you've slipped into them. That will manifest differently for everybody, but the most common one for me is almost certainly obsessing over new bits of gear that I could buy and what I could do with them. Similarly, there are times where I really need to just focus on something else, like completing a bit of work by a deadline, doing dishes maybe, or even just going to bed. This is something that I actually really struggle with, even when I recognise that I'm getting carried away. And there are some things that I try to do to manage those times quite deliberately. For example, ideally anyway, not buying anything on eBay after 11 PM when I know that I'm most susceptible to falling into that particular trap. Or setting particular times by which or by when I have to do something else, like walk the dog or something like that. I've seen the Pomodoro method talked about a lot in this regard, where you set a timer of 25 minutes to really knuckle down on something with a hard stop, or at least a break mandated at that point. I believe the idea behind this was perhaps originally to help people focus on tasks and might otherwise be struggling to find motivation, but I also think it works well to prevent you slipping into extended periods of unhelpful fixation, using that external interruption to redirect or remind you to do something else. The most effective way that I've found to break out of these periods of intense hyperfocus though is to deliberately redirect my attention in a more positive direction. That can sometimes feel entirely impossible when you're in the thick of it, but I've found that it is easier to do if you shift your focus to a related area, as opposed to trying to undertake a total mental handbrake turn. For example, if I find myself getting caught up in the idea of building out an entire new Eurorack case with all of the associated costs that that would bring, looking at the modules I've already got and trying to actually understand them better can be a much healthier off-ramp. In fact, actually just using the modular system rather than sitting online reading about it and watching new gear videos is often a perfect antidote for that kind of dopamine craving. In these cases, deliberately simplifying what I'm working on has helped as well, in the sense that I've got some awesome modules that I always use a certain way or don't really appreciate as much until I use them on their own with a really basic sequence, and I can actually hear and understand what is going on to a much greater degree. Having a wide bank of different ongoing projects, ideas or experiments that I know I'm interested in thus also becomes a positive thing rather than a negative, as those can be used to trigger new waves of focus. And I think that is kind of key. Ensure that you've got a variety of different things that you can get excited about, And then when necessary, plant those seeds in your mind and gently shift the rails of your mental track to lead down that path instead. Just make sure that you have things set up in such a way where the transition can be as smooth and seamless as possible. If you have to wire up an elaborate collection of gear to get a start, it's going to be much harder to shift your focus as required. Another way to think about this, or even just to make the most of these cycles of productivity, is to realise that none of them exist in a vacuum. They can and do complement each other, and just because you're currently focused on one thing, it doesn't mean that every other area is, completely abandoned or discarded. I've mentioned before on this channel that when writing bits of music, I try to finish as many tracks as possible and do so within a fairly short time scale, because I know just how short my attention span can be. If I have to spend endless hours twiddling away at something, then it will never be completed. So I deliberately condense that where possible. One of the main sources of tension that comes up as a result is that I often feel like doing anything that isn't focused specifically on directly writing or recording for a specific track is wasteful, because it isn't clearly productive. At least not in a way that produces something tangible like a finished song at the end of it. What has been really helpful has been to use periods where I have to do something else in a way that helps prepare for the next wave of heightened creative motivation. For example, if I'm recording clips for a synth demo video, rather than me treating that as an entirely disconnected activity from making actual music and thus somehow not as deservingly productive in some way, I try and think of it as an opportunity to create and build up loops that I can then save for the next inevitable period of hyperfocus on composition. That way I'm deliberately utilising the usefulness of each wave to benefit and inspire the next, and they can flow into one another in a much more rewarding manner. I think that doing so doesn't just give you some clarity and a sense of purpose about periods which may feel less immediately obviously productive, but also helps bring about cyclical waves of focus and motivation in a more predictable fashion, as one helps create momentum for the next. It's kind of like the idea of a sigmoid curve, if you've seen that, where you build upon your momentum rather than having to start from the bottom each time. Coincidentally, as I started thinking through some of this stuff and was putting down my thoughts on paper, Mylar Melodies actually uploaded a video talking about modular systems and gear acquisition syndrome specifically. And in that, it touches upon some of these ideas and has some really helpful advice. So if you resonate with any of this at all, I would recommend giving that a watch, especially because I think he approaches these topics in a really genuine, thoughtful way, something that is often sorely lacking on YouTube. I'm really interested to hear what other people think about all of this, because for everybody that struggles to find any inspiration to be creative, I suspect that there are equal numbers of folks who, like me, have something of the opposite problem, balancing out these kinds of periods of hyperfocus and oscillating between feelings of intense productivity and guilt. Let me know if this strikes a chord with you, or if, I'm just a fucking nutcase, which is quite possible.